Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is coming for former President Donald Trump over his recent comments surrounding Russia's war with Ukraine. Over the past year, Trump has repeatedly said he would solve the war if reelected, pledging, quote, "I will have it solved within one day, a peace between them." The former president also suggested it would be an easy negotiation between Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin, per The Hill. Zelensky called Trump's rhetoric, quote, "very dangerous," and also invited Trump to Ukraine.
Would you invite him to Kyiv to come and visit?
With pleasure. With pleasure.
Invite him now. Invite him on.
Yes, please. Donald Trump, I invite you to Ukraine, to Kyiv. So if you can stop the war during 24 hours, I think it will be enough to come to Kyiv.
All right.
In any day, I mean.
We'll make sure that he gets the message, yeah.
Meanwhile, at Davos, U.S. Special Representative to Ukraine, Penny Pritzker, made the case for a pathway for Ukraine into the European Union.
Long-term pathway into the EU and NATO. And that combination is extremely powerful when it comes to reconstruction. Then you add on top of it the world's richest soil that's capable of feeding the world and inexpensive IT specialization. And you add those capabilities, you add all those qualities together, that makes this a particularly compelling situation. The challenge, of course, is we're in the middle of a war. So we've got to deal, of course, with the first situation before we can deal with the past, but we don't have to wait. The situation in Ukraine, the way I think about it, and it's because I'm a runner, I think about it as a sprint and a marathon. And you know, the goal is a long-term, sustainable, digital, clean, competitive European Ukraine integrated into global markets. That's the marathon.
The concern isn't that you're in a war to kind of on-ramp Ukraine into the EU and NATO. The concern is that the war is largely precipitated by extending this carrot of Ukraine joining NATO in the first instance. And a reminder that if it had been a member of NATO, the implication of Russia's involvement would mean a full-scale war with our involvement and arguably World War III. Right. So to be so very cavalierly trotting that out in this kind of a elite context at Davos, is it just widely out of touch? Is there an indifference to the reality of the conditions that precipitated this conflict? What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, the case for Ukraine being in NATO would be, I mean, theoretically, for the people advocating that, would be to prevent Russia from invading it.
Right.
But that already happened.
Right.
So do we think if Ukraine was magically in NATO now, what Russia would be like, oops, we have to withdraw? We'd be committed to defending them. That seems like a disaster. That's without even asking all the questions about whether they qualify for membership in this organization, whether their institutions are sufficiently robust from a democratic standpoint, and all of that. We've talked about all the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, political freedom issues going on there.
Jailing journalists who died in Ukrainian custody, we covered last week.
So Trump says he wants to have a negotiation between Putin and Zelensky and end the war in 24 hours. I don't know if he can make that happen, but it certainly sounds good to me. Nice to have goals goals for 2024. And as we've discussed, you know, there was a plan for negotiation for peace. Zelensky should welcome that because he can't hold out forever. Ukraine is its people are being killed, destroyed. The army, the military age young men, thousands and thousands of deaths for maintaining the entire sovereignty of this country. But there has to be a negotiation. We are past the point, so many in the U.S., where we want to continue funding this resistance effort. We're at a point where the U.S. would have to approve more funding. It's possible that kind of deal comes through if Republicans get what they want on the border. But a lot of Republican primary voters don't want to do that anymore. Obviously, there's dissatisfaction in your corners of the political realm with what's going on there. It's really past time to consider negotiation, and the fresh perspective of a Trump-like figure. Who knows?
Well, it didn't seem from the tone, if I can do just a little bit of reading between the lines, that Zelensky was especially confident that Trump's pledge that he could to wrap this whole thing up.
But Zelensky doesn't want him to, right? Because it's going to involve negotiations that probably have to do with the disputed territories no longer being in Ukrainian hands. So what I read in there was he was actually worried of the prospect of Donald Trump achieving exactly that.
I guess I don't read it quite that way. I do think that Ukrainians are now in a difficult situation where they've been led on under false pretenses to engage in a war and incur all these costs that don't put them any closer to a place where they can have a better negotiation position than they did a month into this crisis, when they had the full commitment and support of the entire world, monetarily and kind of psychically.
Right. And when they had won some military battles against Russia, Russia's efforts stalled more than expected.
Right, which is also when there were attempts at negotiation that were scuttled by the UK and the United States of America. So, it's hard for me to imagine. I don't think it's a scenario where they want war to continue, but I do think there's this interesting push and pull now where do you stop now at a point where you're least advantaged because the people who drew you into this less advantaged position are no longer willing to give you money. I mean, kind of morally, it's a very difficult, troubling place to be in. Just for some background, we have the United States has already committed about $75 billion to Ukraine. In October, Biden requested an additional $60 billion in military aid. There has been intractability here because the Ukraine aid, the Israel aid, and border funding are all being tied together in one package. And what we saw with the leadership battle in the House with Republicans is that I do really think that there is a lot of pressure on Mike Johnson to listen to and capitulate to the base of the Republican Party that is very negative on the idea of increasing aid to Ukraine. Although the majority of the Republican Party is very much aggressively wanting to do that, that's in one corner. The kind of collective interest in resolving the border crisis is in one corner, but there's also some resistance there because Joe Biden is proposing, frankly, very, I don't know what other word to use other than conservative border policy that there's resistance to within the Republican Party. I think because in that case, I think there is a political benefit to being able to keep arguing the border crisis isn't being resolved. There's nothing being done on the border. If they can hold up money that Biden wants to send to fund border agents and the like and ramp up basically security at the border, then that helps them electorally going into an election year. So there are different political reasons why each of these need to be held up. Of course, I think there's a very big bipartisan consensus on wanting the Israel aid to go through. But even there, I do think there's a creeping realization that the Biden base's frustration, or should I say disgust, with the sheer death toll numbers coming out of Israel are a real political liability for him as well. So it's going to be very interesting to watch how that bolus gets resolved.
Right. Meanwhile, and a lot of in the Republican Party, there is obviously more support for helping Israel, for being close with Israel and giving aid. Although there is also a healthy non-interventionist contingent on the right. But that means that this money being spent toward Ukraine seems, I think, even additionally wasted, because there are some conservatives who don't want to spend any money, which I'm more sympathetic to, I'm more ideologically in cahoots with, don't want to spend any American tax dollars on foreign wars or overseas security for other nations, so that you have that part of it. And then you have the part of the right that wants to spend that specifically with Israel, and it feels like the Middle Eastern situation is more important for American interest than this dispute between Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, I mean, and back to the Ukraine piece of it, Biden's top aides are privately saying, this is according to reporting from NBC, that Russia could win the war in a matter of weeks if this funding doesn't come. Now, that could just be a rhetorical dance used to try to pressure people into pushing an aid package through. But it also is a really interesting signal to be putting out there that, of course, Russia can read this as easily as I can. And what level of desperation does that telegraph if they're saying that out loud?
It sounds like all the Democratic fundraising pitches everybody gets on their phone. Like, hello, Robby. Hello, Briahna. This is Nancy Pelosi. Do you have time to send $20 or the MAGA agenda is about to triumph or whatever it is?
Right. Lives are on the line if you don't send this money within the next 20 minutes.
I need to be honest with you, Briahna. Like, that's the tone of the emails. Right. It's such a... I'm not mad. I'm disappointed. More rising right after this.